Okay, thanks everybody for coming to the colloquium. This is, I know, an unusual time. The colloquiums are usually Wednesdays at 4, but today at 4 there was a Microsoft event that we didn't want to conflict with, so we have the colloquium today at 11. I'm very pleased to introduce Eddie Nikolova, or Dokia Nikolova, who is here from UT Austin. I've known her for maybe 15 years, a decade, something like that, and we were in grad school together, so I'm quite happy to have her visiting, and she's done a lot of really great work on routing and networks when the edges are like stochastic. And so, you know, the sort of famous Canadian problem of you want to drive from Toronto to Ottawa and there's a snowstorm and you don't know which roads are washed out. So it's all very practical, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you. So I really am grateful for the invitation to spend the week here. It's my first time actually as a slightly longer visitor than just a day. I'll talk about network pricing, how to induce optimal flows under strategic link operators, and this is joint work with all these wonderful and happy people that you see here on the slide: Jose Correa, Cristobal Guzman, Thanasis Leones, who is my postdoc at UT Austin, and Mark Schroeder, who is a postdoc at Jose Correa. So we have three people from Chile, two Chileans. What motivated us to study this is to understand price competition in networks. And when we think of price competition in general and intuitively, we think that it is something good. It drives prices down, which is beneficial to customers. And here we wanted to understand price competition in a network when we route traffic. And it turns out that when we have congestion externalities from this traffic routing, this might lead prices the other way. So a new feature here is that with price competition, we may end up with higher prices rather than lower prices. How could that happen? A higher price on a given route could result to people choosing alternative routes, but then those alternative routes may get more congested, thereby making those routes less appealing. And so a higher price may very well make a route more popular. And so we want to, so this is not something good for the consumer. Here we are sort of consumer oriented in this work. We want to achieve good outcomes for the consumer. And so our solution is to regulate competition slightly by imposing price caps on how much network operators can charge on the edges. And here is our concrete model. So maybe before I go on, I should take a quick poll of how familiar people are with theory and then with game theory, so that I know how to adjust my explanation. So maybe like theory-oriented people in the audience, and then some game theory. Okay. So I'll try to explain things in layman terms so that people who are not necessarily theoretically inclined would also gain something from this talk. But please stop me at any time if you have any questions. So our formal model is we have a directed network with multiple sources and sinks. We have an amount of traffic that needs to be routed between each source sink pair. And each edge has a flow-dependent latency function, this LE of x that you see on this edge, which says that, think of that as the travel time on this edge. So x is the flow on the edge. The more flow we have on a given edge, or the more people use that edge, the more traffic is on that edge, the more the travel time will increase. In this model, users are non-atomic. So we think of users as infinitesimally small and infinitely many. So we think of users as a flow vector that can be split among different paths. Furthermore, each edge is owned by a profit maximizing company. A company just owns one edge, and it sets a price on this edge. so as to maximize its own profit. So we are interested in understanding the outcomes that result. First of all, what prices would firms set on the edges, and then what would be the traffic pattern or the flow pattern resulting from those prices. And when we think of a flow pattern, there are two flows that are sort of classic notions that appear in network routing. One is the notion of optimal flow. So this is the flow that minimizes total travel time. Mathematically, that's given by this cost function. So it's summation over all the edges in the network of the travel time on this edge times the flow amount on this edge, or the number of users on this edge. So this is the total travel time, and the flow x star is optimal if it has minimal such travel time. The other notion of flow that's important is that of an equilibrium flow. An equilibrium flow is defined as the flow in which users use least cost paths. So all users route along shortest paths, where by shortest I mean total travel time plus price. So here is how we formalize this mathematically. We say that a flow x, which depends on the prices, on the tolls, is a Wardrop equilibrium or a Nash equilibrium, the same thing in this situation, for a given toll vector t, or a set of prices t, such that whenever we compare two paths, p and p prime, and path p is being used by somebody, then the cost of that path, the total travel time along the path, summing the travel times of the edges in the path plus tolls, is less than or equal to the travel time plus price of any other path. So basically users use least cost paths. And the famous result, yes?
Just a quick question. L of V is like cost in dollars, and same with T of V is like supposed to be, like they're in the same units.
L of V is, think of that as the travel time. The travel time is a function of the flow on the edge, xe, or number of users on the edge. And the flow on the edge, the flow pattern depends on the prices. So T here are tolls or prices. I'll use this interchangeably. So the flow pattern, I'll clarify why the dependence is such in a couple of slides.
So we're kind of adding time with price, or is it like...
Why do we add, what are the units? So your question is, here it's time units and this is money, essentially. So this is a very standard assumption in the congestion games literature, or actually more broadly in mechanism design. So it assumes that we have quasi-linear utilities where we basically sum together units of happiness and money. Sometimes they may be different units and it may appear nonsensical to sum the two together. But that's the standard assumption, that when users in a network route and they are interested in minimizing both their travel time and the money, the tolls they pay, then it's a standard assumption. They'll minimize a linear combination of the travel time and money. So we use an additive. And we could use a coefficient here. It won't really change things. But yeah, it's an assumption that we have a linear combination. And you could ask what happens if it's not a linear combination and something else. But this is the most basic model.
So are we assuming that like the time is equal to the money by some?
We assume that we care about the units of time and the units of money equally, in the sense that we want to minimize the sum of the two. Yeah.
Is this, so with respect to the previous definition, if I set, is the previous one a special case of a Wardrop equilibrium?
So that's an excellent question. So typically equilibrium is defined without these tolls. So there are no prices. And in a classical congestion game model, we just have these latency functions that capture how much travel time increases due to more flow. And the standard Wardrop equilibrium definition is just without those t's. Typically, Wardrop equilibrium, an equilibrium flow, differs from an optimal flow this leads to this term selfish routing. So assuming that everyone routes so as to minimize their own travel time, we arrive at an equilibrium flow situation that may lead to everyone experiencing more travel time than an optimal flow that aims to minimize total travel time. So then the question is, can a social planner with a global look at the entire traffic lead users to the optimal flow? And the result, the classic result from more than 50 years ago, is that if we introduce tolls, if we introduce appropriate tolls, then users that then minimize their travel time plus toll can end up in that socially optimal, in that optimal flow situation. So it's a wonderful, it's a classical result. So in the absence of tolls, those two flows are generally different. With appropriate tolls, they can coincide. But now the question is, what if we don't have a central planner that dictates those tolls, but instead we have sort of self-interested profit-maximizing firms, so toll operators? What happens then? And what happens then is that we may end up even much farther from the optimal flow than the Nash equilibrium, so things can get much worse. So let me just clarify, first of all, the game that we consider. So the toll operators, or the firms, set tolls on their edges. Once they see the tolls, the users decide which are their best routes to follow that minimize their travel time plus toll, and they arrive at this equilibrium flow that I defined on the previous slide. And then, given that flow, the companies may reconsider the price they set. They may think, well, oh, I wish I set a higher price because I'm not making enough money. I have already a lot of people routing through me, and so firms may adjust their toll. So they'll keep adjusting until they reach an equilibrium. And so a toll vector or a price vector is an equilibrium if nobody wants to change their price that they set. So at the current price, they're maximizing their profit. Their profit is the toll they set, the price they set, times how many users use their link, times the flow. And so this is their current profit is greater than or equal to the profit they would get for using any other price or toll, TE prime. And so this is an equilibrium. So this is what I'll refer to as an equilibrium, even though remember that we have an equilibrium notion for just the users. I'll call this Nash flow, maybe not to confuse these two notions of equilibrium. But basically, I'll just focus on the set of tolls as an equilibrium, and each set of tolls always induces a corresponding Nash flow, where users would route appropriately using minimum cost paths. So just focus, when I say equilibrium, I'll just be thinking about the toll vector, the set of prices. There is relatively sparse work in this area, even though it seems like a natural question. And the related work roughly falls in two categories. One, where people only look at very specific class of networks consisting of parallel edges. So we have a single source destination with multiple parallel edges or parallel paths connecting the two. Or they don't have a general latency function that captures the travel time to flow dependence. So it's a capacity-based congestion where think of the latency function as being 0 all the way and then suddenly shoots up to infinity when we reach the capacity. So ours is the first work that combines arbitrary latency functions with general network topologies. So let me say what is known first of all about this general situation. We know that, so it's fairly easy to derive that an equilibrium exists, and we can even compute what it is. If we have a parallel link network and the latencies are affine, so they are just linear functions of the flow. So we know that then a Nash equilibrium exists, and remarkably, That's a very special, limited situation. So remarkably, even if we deviate on either one, on affine latency functions or the parallel network structure, then we lose the equilibrium existence. So we have counterexamples for when the network is parallel and the latency functions are quadratic, so just a step beyond linear. Or we can keep the latency functions linear, but have a slightly different topology from the parallel links network, and again we lose equilibrium.
What's the intuition? Is this non-existence of pure strategies, non-existence of mixed strategies?
So, pure strategies first of all. Okay. And remember, the strategies are, we think about just a vector of prices. So it's an equilibrium among the network operators, the link operators. And it's pure strategies, and they set a price vector, but I mean, each link set its own price, and the price can be, you know, any real number.
I'm just trying to think of like
what causes that?
What breaks in the,
yeah.
the fixed point theorem in some equiquantity.
Yeah, exactly. So in the fixed point theorem, intuitively, first of all, you can think that in a classic fixed point theorem application, you need a compact convex set of strategies. So compactness means boundedness, whereas here prices can go from 0 to infinity. That's one thing. But I'll show you that that's not the only thing, because even if we, that was one reason why initially we were trying to prove equilibrium existence, and we thought, yeah, I guess we really need this boundedness. So then we thought of imposing those price caps, so that the prices can only go up to a certain upper bound, but this was still not enough.
Okay.
And here is one example. So this is an example where we have linear latency functions, and they're very simple. Latency function x, x2, and x on the corresponding links. And we have 4 edges, 4 toll operators setting their prices to t1, t2 through t4. And if we have this example, for example, T2, so the second firm sets its price to 3 over 2, the third one to 0, and the fourth one to this number. And then the first company, the first edge over there, has its profit function looking like this, which is something non-concave. So it has, in particular, it has two maxima, 2 local maxima. And so we see that the best response is non-convex, and we need convexity in the fixed point theorem. So this is another thing that breaks down, even if we have price caps. So there, basically, we go into very severe non-existent situations because of this network structure. And here is something else. Even if equilibrium exists, what I mentioned at the very beginning, price competition may not necessarily be good. Prices may spike up rather than go down. So in this very simple example, we have only 2 competing toll operators, so only 2 routes from our source to the destination. And if we do the computation for the optimal flow and the equilibrium flow, we see that the equilibrium flow can be arbitrarily, unboundedly more expensive than the optimal flow.
Is the equilibrium unique here?
Yes, the equilibrium is unique here.
It seems that perhaps the non-existence should depend also on the fact that you don't allow edges to combine. So for instance,
on the fact that we don't allow edges?
Edges to combine. So for instance,
to combine.
So if one firm were to operate like a bunch of different edges, presumably it would be able to. Might be
absolutely. So that you're bringing me all the way to the open questions at the end. So that's something that we haven't considered. For sure, it would change the structure of the game very much if we have one company allowed to own multiple edges rather than a single edge. Yeah.
If one company owns all the edges, is it the same as a central planner? Will it will the maximum profit of the company owning everything be the?
I would think so. Yeah. So we think of a central planner as like a benevolent dictator. So if we drop the benevolent, you know, if a monopoly owns all the edges and has a different goal rather than improving travel time for everyone, then we may get a different result. But yeah, it's like a central planner.
I would just to not leave the question of economic power a little bit, I would think that would be an empirical question. I think we have a historical indication that monopoly power does not act the same as a central planner.
Because the network question.
Yeah, it may be that maximizing maximizing flow is not the same as maximizing stable revenue, which is not the same as maximizing maintenance of monopoly power, right? So it's not clear that a central planner who doesn't have an economic vested interest. So I mean, I think part of it is this question that was just asked, which is this model depends on imagining that every edge is separate. It also comes back to the question that was asked before, where if you want to treat time and cost as just like a maximizing function, if I'm a small company and I want to maximize like congestion and price, but I'm up against Netflix, and Netflix has a cachet of money and doesn't mind if the toll's high short term in order to get their traffic through faster than me so that I drop off the map, then that notion of us both trying to maximize low prices and fast congestion is not equal. So it seems like economic power is is hidden underneath this model, right, or is being marked off in this model.
Very much so, yeah. I agree with you full-heartedly, and you actually bring up much complexities that we haven't considered in the model, like maybe repeated decision-making or dynamic over multiple periods and so on. So this is really a static shot. That's true. And so, right, so we have all these different issues that in this model, that equilibria may not exist, and I did not give you an example, but we also can come up with an example where if they exist, they may not be unique, and they can be arbitrarily inefficient. And so our solution was to regulate competition by imposing these upper bounds on the prices that toll operators can set. And it turns out that with this solution, with appropriate caps, we can solve all three problems at one time. And towards our main result, let me give you some definitions. So let T bar be a cap vector, so a vector of upper bounds on the prices. We are going to call T bar optimal if it induces the optimal flow. So we think of optimal flow as something good for the users, as the efficient solution for network traffic. And as I mentioned earlier, when I distinguished between the optimal flow and the equilibrium flow, and I said from classic theory we know that with appropriate tolls we can drive users who route selfishly to the optimal flow. So this is precisely the set of tolls that lead us to the optimal flow. So if the toll on each edge is set to the derivative of the latency function times the flow, and again x star is the optimal flow, then users that minimize their total route cost of travel time plus toll will exactly go to the optimal flow. So the resulting Nash flow is optimal. And furthermore, let's combine the notions of optimal flow and the price caps that we impose. So we call T bar a cap equilibrium if setting the tolls to this T bar is a Nash equilibrium for the game with upper bounds T bar. Meaning, if we only allow deviations down from this cap, then this is an equilibrium. And we call T bar a great set of tolls if it is optimal and is a cap equilibrium. In other words, we set prices we set caps. So we say you cannot exceed those caps. If those caps, to start with, were once chosen carefully to induce the optimal flow, then they happen to be a great set of tolls. And so our main question here is, do great tolls exist? And if so, what is their structure? Can we describe them? And towards our main result, let me start off with the most natural choice of tolls, which is I'll call these the marginal tolls, the tolls that lead from equilibrium to the optimal flow. So if we set those, so this is a great set of tolls. So think of that as our first result. And moreover, under those caps equal to the marginal tolls, the Nash equilibrium is unique. So the only Nash equilibrium will be those tolls themselves. There's nothing under. And furthermore, it's also a strong Nash equilibrium. Strong Nash equilibrium means that no coalitions can deviate in a way that members of the coalition can benefit. So here is a sketch of the proof. So it's based on two lemmas. First is, notice that marginal tolls are optimal from the classical result. Lemma 1 is a monotonicity lemma that says that if I increase my price, I'll get less flow. Lemma 2 is less obvious. It's something about the structure of best response or an optimal strategy. So I want to maximize my profit on my edge. And this lemma says that the local maximum of the profit function, toll times flow, satisfies that it's greater than or equal to this corresponding marginal toll. And putting those two together, so proof by contradiction. So remember, I'm proving that those marginal tolls are a great set of tolls, meaning they're a kappa equilibrium, meaning that no one has incentive to deviate down. No one will raise their profit by deviating down. So suppose the contrary, suppose that I can deviate down and get higher profit, so I'm setting a toll that's less than the marginal toll. Then applying lemma 2, this local maximizer must be greater than or equal to the corresponding marginal. But then it's so, I shouldn't be calling this marginal, maybe it's just an expression, the latency prime times the flow at the corresponding flow, which may not be the optimal flow. I started out saying that I'm deviating, so I'm less than the marginal toll. But then looking at those two expressions on both sides of TE, this is an increasing function whenever the L is convex. That was one of our starting assumptions. And so this expression being less than that one implies that the argument, the flow, is less than the optimal flow. And this is a contradiction with the monotonicity lemma. Lower toll should mean more flow, but here I'm getting the opposite. So this is maybe a simpler intuition for what happens, how we get that those marginal tolls are great tolls. And our main result is something basically a little bit more general than that. Not only are the marginal tolls a great set of tolls, but any toll vector below the marginal tolls that induces the optimal flow is also a great set of tolls. And I'll just note that we can have infinitely many tolls that lead to optimal flow, and so we actually have a rich set of great tolls to work with. And towards proving this result, and I hope I don't disappoint people by focusing the rest of the talk on proving this result, so maybe if you lose your interest in the technical details, you can zone out. But it's based on, again, the two lemmas that I mentioned, the monotonicity lemma and a lemma about the structure of the profit maximizing toll. So here is the monotonicity lemma stated with one more condition. So if I increase my toll to T prime, I'll get less flow, but I'll also end up with a higher overall edge cost of travel time plus toll. So I increase my price, I get less flow, and also my overall cost increases of travel time plus toll. I'm keeping that, even though it's redundant. Lemma 2 is a generalization of Lemma 1. It's just this is what we actually use. So the proof is based on Lemma 2 and Lemma 3. But I kept that for you to see the connection. So this is a generalized monotonicity lemma when not just a single person deviates, but multiple people may deviate. So consider two toll vectors where one is less than the other ones in just some coordinates. Then there exist two edges, and those two edges may be the same. For the first edge, we can apply the monotonicity lemma, meaning not apply, but the condition holds, where if the edge increases its toll, it will get less flow. If we have multiple edges decreasing, we may not get that for everyone because of the interaction of, because of the network topology. And so we cannot guarantee that this holds for every edge that lowers its price, but we know that at least there exists an edge, E1 or a different one, for which the sign of changes is less than or equal to 0. So the sign is, so the change in flow times the change in edge cost is less than or equal to 0. So those two, change in flow and change in edge cost, have different signs. And the third one is the lemma that I stated before about the structure of local maximizers of the profit. So a toll TE greater than 0 is a local maximizer of the profit function, the toll times the flow. Then that toll must be greater than or equal to the corresponding marginal. And I'll, based on time, I'll walk you through as much detail as I can cover on those lemmas. Yeah.
So you mentioned that this is a strong Nash equilibrium.
Yes.
Getting back to Tarleton's question a little bit, you might wonder something even stronger, which is if there's just one agent who controlled all of the edges, that if I had these caps, that sort of the profit maximizing thing would also generate like the socially optimal flow. So like even if a coalition could sort of pool their money, it would still be best. Do we know one way or the other, like if that could be true or if it's clearly not? Can you say it one more time? So if we, so you're thinking of one firm owning all the edges, and you are rephrasing that as a coalition that perhaps the coalition may be all the edges together who can deviate. Right. And I guess I'm wondering if adding these caps sort of resolves this tension between profit and welfare. That like, even if there's just one global company controlling all the edges, if they had to work on these caps. That's a good question. So I haven't thought about that, but this is indeed the result. Since we show it's a strong Nash equilibrium, no coalition can deviate profitably, including every single edge participating in the coalition. So under the strong Nash equilibrium, it's that, so even if they could pool their money, it's... So the strong Nash equilibrium says that, so if the tolls are upper bounded by those caps, then those caps end up being the unique, and it is also strong Nash equilibrium. So it's a strong Nash equilibrium. So given those caps, even if all edges come together in a coalition, they cannot do any better. Yeah. Okay, so there's the two notions of coalition, one where no individual can be better off, and the other that, like you're saying. Saying the same if you are, because in this strong Nash equilibrium, everybody's setting their tolls equal to the cap. You can imagine a situation where one, yeah. Okay, no, that's a good question. I also have to think more about it. So I'll, again, so we only use, Lemma 2 is a generalization of Lemma 1, and we use, the proof is based on Lemma 2 and Lemma 3, so let me, we actually have a compact representation of the proofs on one slide each, of course suppressing many details, but you can get an idea what the proofs look like. So Lemma 2 had two parts. The first part was that if multiple edges deviate down, then there is at least one edge for which the higher price leads to less flow. And the way we prove that is first remembering something I didn't tell you, but it's from the classic theory of congestion games, that the equilibrium
minimizes a potential function given by this. So the equilibrium can be viewed as a solution to, it's a convex function, a solution to a convex program, minimizing this function in red over the set of feasible flows. This is what leads to equilibrium existence and uniqueness. And so those two tall vectors will lead to two corresponding Nash flows, x of t and x of t prime. We know for each of them being equilibrium under the corresponding tall, they minimize this potential. And so for the tall vector t, its corresponding Nash flow minimizes f of t, so it's less than or equal to f of t at the other flow resulting from tall vector t prime, and vice versa. The second one we can rewrite in this way, and then summing those two together, the potentials cancel out. Putting everything on one side, we get that summation over all the edges which have smaller tall. The change in tall times the change in flow would be less than or equal to 0. So there exists at least one edge for which this term is less than or equal to 0. Therefore, for one edge that deviates down, it will get higher flow. This is the first part of lemma 2. The second part of lemma 2 said there exists a second edge, potentially the same as the first one, where with a higher tall t prime, we may not necessarily know in which direction the flow changes, but we know that the sign of the change of flow times the sign of the change of edge costs is less than or equal to 0. And the way we show this is recalling another property of equilibrium flows. So equilibrium flows satisfy a variational inequality. So this is simply, if you haven't heard of that, it's simply an equality of this form. So this is an equilibrium flow, this is any other flow, and this is the edge cost that players face. So the well-known fact about equilibria are that they satisfy that for any other flow, this inequality is less than or equal to 0. So x e of t is an equilibrium flow for this tall vector t. When it's an equilibrium flow, it's a Nash flow when edges have this cost, travel time plus tau. And so if we consider any other flow, x e of t prime, this summation is less than or equal to 0. Similarly, x c of t prime is the Nash flow that corresponds to tall vector t prime, and so we again apply this variation inequality, which says that for any other flow here, the summation is less than or equal to 0. And adding those inequalities together and rearranging slightly, we get terms of this form. And we split the summation for edges for which the tolls are equal and edges for which the tolls are strictly smaller, because in the equal part, these tolls cancel out, they're the same. And we get that the summation of everything is less than or equal to 0. Well, the term for which the tolls are the same is greater than or equal to 0 because of the monotonicity of latency functions. And so this first term is greater than or equal to 0, therefore the second term is less than or equal to 0, and for at least one edge, this expression is less than or equal to 0, which is what we wanted to prove. So again, when we have one tall vector t less than another tall vector t prime, where strictly less is for just some of the edges, then there exists an edge for which the change in flow times the change in edge cost is less than or equal to 0. And then lemma 3, captured all in one slide nicely, is again, it says that a local maximizer of the profit function, tall te greater than 0, must satisfy that it's greater than or equal to xc, the flow times the derivative of the latency function. for the corresponding edge. And so the proof, there are some technicalities, so we want to allow situations where so these proofs by pictures are better. So the profit function is a function of the toll. May look like that, or here we want to allow situations where we may have a kink at the maximum, which is why we have this right derivative d plus. So d plus is the right derivative approaching from the right. And we care about understanding that local maximizer of the profit function. So let me just say here toll E. So we know that for the local maximizer approaching from the right, the derivative is less than or equal to 0. So this is what I have over here. The derivative of the profit function is less than or equal to 0. So, and the derivative of the profit function, remember the profit function is the flow times the toll. So applying the chain rule, we have the flow plus the toll times the derivative of the flow. So this whole thing is less than or equal to 0, from where we derive, moving things, rearranging things, that minus flow over the derivative of the flow is less than or equal to TE. Then, by continuity and optimality, we consider a small neighborhood around this local maximizer. And for this neighborhood, we have that the flow XE, so let's call this SE, something in the neighborhood. So we have that, first of all, notice that the derivative of the flow is less than or equal to 0 because this is something greater than or equal to 0, this is something greater than 0, therefore derivative of the flow is less than or equal to 0. So first of all, in this, going in this direction, when you increase the toll, the flow will be decreasing. And thus in this neighborhood here we have that the flow XC of SC is between 0 and XC of TE. Lemma 1 was the one that, the monotonicity lemma, which told us that the sign of the change of flow times the sign of the change of edge cost is less than or equal to 0. So we state that here, rearrange terms, and we take limits on both sides to get that the derivative of the edge flow is less than or equal to minus 1 over the right derivative of the flow. And multiplying both by the flow, we get the last expression. Applying inequality 1, we get the desired result. So the result that we wanted was to show that the local maximizer is greater than or equal to the corresponding marginal toll. Okay. And so the main theorem again is that whenever we bound tolls by the marginal tolls, and in fact whenever we bound them by any t-bar that's less than or equal to the marginal tolls, then this t-bar is the unique strong Nash equilibrium. So again, in one slide we can show that it's a Nash equilibrium, and then we can also show uniqueness. So for strong Nash equilibrium, suppose the contrary. So assume that there is a coalition that can deviate profitably, so that all members that deviate, so the this is our notation for the edges that get less tall, that reduce their tall, their profit is greater than or equal to the profit they were getting at the cap. And since they're deviating down, TE is less than TE bar, we get that this profit at the cap is greater than TE times the flow they were getting at the cap. From here, we, so canceling TE on both sides, we get that first of all, the flow at the smaller toll is greater than the flow at the cap. And also the green inequality, rearranging it, we get that the toll is greater than or equal to the original profit over the flow. Now, Lemma 2, remember, was our monotonicity lemma, which said that for all edges that get less tall, the sign changes are such that we get less than or equal to 0. So the change in flow times the change in edge costs is less than or equal to 0. And since we know in this case that the new flow is smaller, the old flow at the cap was smaller, we know that this is less than or equal to 0, so this here should be greater than or equal to 0, and just from the second term we get this inequality, putting parts of it on the other side. Then we use convexity of the latency functions to establish this first inequality that looks a bit messy, but again it's easier seen from a picture. So this inequality that follows convexity just says that for a convex function, when we take the derivative at a given spot, the derivative would be of a smaller slope than something like that. And so we have, let me make sure I draw them correctly, so this is LE of x. This here is XE, and we know that the flow at the cap is smaller than the flow when we reduced our toll. And so visually this is the picture that provides that first inequality. So then the second is the blue one, so it follows from the blue on top. The third one follows from the green over here, just substituting TE with this ratio and flipping the sign. And finally, so I'm just rewriting the first part here. Derivative of LE times the change in flow is less than or equal to, so for this part I'm claiming that the red term is less than or equal to this red term over here, and this follows from remembering that TE bar is less than or equal to the corresponding marginal toll, which is defined as LE prime of the optimal flow times the optimal flow. But remembering that TE bar to start with was an optimal toll vector, this is, the flows are the same. So times XC of T bar times XC of T bar, because those flows are the same. This is just the optimal flow. And so TE bar is just equal, so I just replace it with something equal, and that's how we get the second part. And now there are a lot of same terms that cancel on both sides, and what we are left with is exactly that the flow at the lower toll is less than the flow at the original, at the cap toll, which is a contradiction with this red inequality. So this is the proof that the cap is a strong Nash equilibrium, And next I'll show that it's the unique equilibrium, so there's no other equilibrium.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
I'm curious. Is this a game of strategic complement?
Is this a game of strategic complements? I don't know what that means.
So if I raise my price, so if I take a price vector for everybody else, and then I take some price vector that dominates it pointwise, is it the case that I always want to raise my price?
If I take one price vector and another one that dominates it, that's higher.
That's higher, and like in the sense of pointwise higher.
Okay.
Then do I want to? Is an optimal response to raise my price?
In which price vector?
Who is I?
Sorry. Yeah, I should use that. Say A has some price. B, C, and D all charge. I consider that it's their best response. So I have A's best response to B, C, and D's vector prices. Now I consider another price vector for B, C, and D that's higher. Is it the case that A should charge more?
Oh, I see. I need to think through the question. My gut reaction is to say no, just because I'm remembering the example I showed you initially of the best response for one link given 3 other links in that little network where we saw that the profit function was like that.
Yes.
But so my gut reaction is to say no, but I need a little more time to think through the question.
One example of maybe if I have 2 parallel paths, but each path has 2 links.
Okay.
That if the other person on the path that share with me raises their price, I might want to reduce my price.
To get people still coming down my link as I go. Great.
Thank you, Brendan. And so, so here is why the cap equilibrium is also the unique equilibrium. Suppose there is some other equilibrium T that differs from that cap equilibrium. So players who play the best response. So for all the edges that charge positive, strictly positive price, I claim that without loss in the other equilibrium, they also should be charging positive price. This is just because if they charge price equal to 0, we can work out the same inequality very easily. So when in the other equilibrium I charge a higher price, since it's an equilibrium, that must be a maximizer, a local maximizer of my profit function. And so applying my lemma about the local maximizer, the toll should be greater than or equal to that corresponding marginal toll. Now, on the other hand, it's less than the cap. That's what I said, since I can only deviate down. The cap itself is less than the marginal toll at the optimal flow. And we see that on both sides here, we have a similar expression. It's the flow times the derivative of the latency function. And so assuming the latency functions are convex, that's a monotone increasing function. Therefore, the corresponding flows follow the same inequality. So the flow at the lower toll is less than the flow at the higher, which is a contradiction with the monotonicity lemma. So that concludes uniqueness. Now, as I mentioned, great tolls are not unique. And in particular, we can write as a corollary of the theorem, we can find many great tolls by just solving a linear system of inequalities. This just captures that the tolls should lead to the optimal flow as the Nash flow, and this sets the cap. So a natural question when we have so many great tolls to choose from is maybe which is the one that minimizes consumer payments, since I started out saying that we are consumer oriented, so we like optimal flow. Now how can we minimize the okay, I should stop soon. So we can write down a linear program to minimize consumer payments in this way. However, that's not necessarily the best set of great tolls, because we have an example showing that the best set of great tolls that minimize consumer payments actually may, in some edges, exceed the marginal toll. So that's now one of our open questions. What we do know is that those great tolls that are less than the marginal, we can find the best among them, And now how closely does that approximate the best overall? We have two bounds that depend on the class of latency functions and the topology of the network. And for example, for affine latencies, this gamma is 1, and so what we can find for best great tolls under the marginals is a 2 approximation of the best overall, but we don't know that for other classes of latency functions. So let me just summarize. So our main result was to introduce great tolls as a way of improving network pricing. And the result was that the marginal tolls are a great set of tolls, but so is also any other toll vector that leads to the optimal Nash flow, to the optimal flow that's less than or equal to the marginal. And the open directions are, for example, those two. So what if companies own more than one edge, but also what is a complete description of the great set of tolls. So thank you very much.